Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first quarter meeting of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We're happy to be here today, and I'd like to start off. So I'm Jeffrey Hales, Chair of the Standards Board, and have with us here the rest of the Standards Board. I'll go through who's attending. I'll note that today's meeting is being both broadcast visually as well as in audio, and is being recorded as well. So for those who are listening, if you have questions about something, you can go back and access that afterward through the SASB website. Would also note that today's meeting, as all of our public meetings, is really meant to be a transparent opportunity as we discuss standard setting activities, but is not intended to be an interactive discussion with the public. That said, we welcome feedback and comments, so I would encourage those who are listening today to submit comments or questions if you have them. There are a couple ways in which you could do that. One way that you could do that is through the webinar directly, but please note, if you submit a question in the webinar, we will track that, but we will not be able to actually respond to that question in real time, but we will have a record of that and can respond later. And as always, you're welcome to go to our public comment portal and submit questions or comments that you may have. And if they relate to today's meeting, please just reference that. So let me go ahead and mention who we have here with us today. So as I go through, since this is also being video cast, I'll ask each of my fellow board members to acknowledge themselves. But again, I'm Jeffrey Hales, Chair of the Standards Board, and we have with us also Dan Geltzer. Raise your hands, Dan, so that viewers can see you.
Chairman.
Lloyd Kurtz, Mark Siegel, Robert Hirth, Stephanie Tang, Verity Chegar, and two of our board members. Kurt Kuhn is unable to be here today, but I think that Elizabeth Seeger is dialing in remotely. Elizabeth, are you there? If you are there, could you acknowledge?
Raise your hand.
Raise your hand. So she may have some technical difficulty.
I don't see a model.
Okay, so hopefully she can join us later. Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the agenda for today. So we're going to be discussing a few new projects and then talking about the existing projects that are already ongoing and what the plan is there. So we will start the morning off with a discussion of two standard setting projects that are being proposed, and then we will have a third project that we'll talk about as a research project we'll get to later on. So I'll note that for those that are maybe not familiar with our process here, we tend to at SASB address things in a project-based approach, and so that involves some project screening as well as then thinking about whether we need additional research before moving forward with proposing some standard setting activity, or whether we have a clear sense that there's an opportunity to improve our existing standards. And so if there is, we will go ahead and add something to our standard setting agenda. So that's the process that we use. We think about the criteria for what we do as relating to really four main principles. The first, of course, being mission alignment with what we do at SASB and looking for an opportunity to significantly improve the communication between companies and investors around sustainability information. We also look for scope or prevalence of an issue to the extent that it affects most companies within an industry or most geographies in which companies operate. We also look for capacity in terms of prioritizing our team's time and the board, the opportunity to bring things before the board to make sure that we're prioritizing that time well. And then we think about feasibility with respect to, is there a clear set of alternatives or proposals that could be brought before the board in a timely fashion. There are many difficult things to solve in the world, and not all of them are things where we can see a path toward a potential standard setting solution to a need of the marketplace. So in order to do some of that prioritization, we have in the past discussed what the board's prioritizations factors are, and there are a number of things that we think about when addressing particular standard setting topics, but kind of some of the key things there would relate to the global applicability of our standards, thinking about alignment of our standards with other standards or frameworks that are out there to make sure that we are addressing both the needs of companies around the world, as well as doing so in a cost-effective fashion through alignment there. Obviously, materiality is something that runs through the core of the way we think about the work that we do. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and jump into the first of our standard setting projects for today. And I'll note that the first one is on measuring performance on raw materials sourcing in the apparel, accessories, and footwear industry. And I will go ahead and pass it over to our project lead there and ask Taylor to go ahead and introduce herself.
Thanks, Jeff. So my name is Taylor Reed. I am the analyst leading standards development on the consumer goods sector. And today I am going to be proposing a standard setting project in the apparel, accessories, and footwear industry. So what we have discovered, some market input and our own internal review have suggested that there are two metrics associated with the raw materials sourcing disclosure topic that currently provide insufficient guidance, which may result in inconsistent calculations and non-comparable disclosures. That market input and our own review has also suggested that there may be an opportunity to improve the completeness of those metrics and further align the metrics with some industry approaches and standards, which may also add to the cost effectiveness of the standard. So we are proposing that the Standards Board approve a standard setting project to revise, clarify, and consider improvements to the two metrics which are up here on the slide. The first one is a qualitative metric, which aims to describe the environmental and social risks associated with sourcing priority raw materials. And the second metric is a quantitative one that asks for a company to report the percentage of raw materials that are third-party certified to an environmental or social sustainability standard. We believe that this project satisfies the criteria for a standard setting project. There is an opportunity to significantly improve communications between investors and companies. This scope is limited to the apparel industry, and this topic, the raw materials sourcing topic, we wouldn't be reassessing the materiality of the topic, but rather looking at the measurement associated with the two underlying metrics. I would be the lead on the project, and while the feasibility of the project is relatively technical, it's limited to two metrics. So it's feasible to expect we could propose a solution to the Standards Board in the next 6 to 12 months. We have identified that this project falls under the two themes here associated with reevaluating the existing content related to measurement and technical protocol issues, which have been defined as lower priority by the staff. However, this is a very timely subject for the industry. Here I've collected just a handful of articles that have come out within the last year of major companies in the industry that have committed to using sustainable materials. And on the bottom is just an initial analysis of some of the leading companies in the industry that have also committed to certain targets related to raw material sourcing and sustainable material use. So this is a very, very important topic in the industry, and one that many companies across the world are paying attention to and focusing on and have actively committed to. So there are lots of companies that are already reporting on this topic. This is just a handful that have committed and produced disclosures that are aligned with the SASB standards. And we can already see that the disclosures, while aligned with the SASB standards, may be able to be improved by more robust guidance. So the comparability may be able to be improved. For example, we have companies that are using estimates in their disclosures. It's unclear whether these companies are integrating certain factors into the calculation, like a loss rate or a waste factor. It's unclear how companies are measuring the weight of the fibers that they're reporting on here. And it's unclear how they may be coming up with these priority raw materials that they're reporting on.
So can I ask a clarifying question? So it seems like part of the issue is not primarily that companies have to estimate some of these matters, but actually that when estimating what those numbers are, it's not clear what is going into it, and there may be differences. So it suggests a challenge around comparability. And is that primarily because we're not specifying clearly enough within the standard how to measure?
I believe so. Yes, there are methods for calculating these types of inputs, but we are not specific to them in the standard. So there are three key concerns that have been raised by input we have received. And the first one is from a company and an industry-focused NGO on the qualitative metric, which I described earlier. And this is that there are certain key terms within the standards and the technical protocol that may be misaligned with commonly accepted terms used in the industry. So an example of that would be the priority raw materials, which is described here on the right side of the slide. And there may be an opportunity to improve the completeness of this by taking an approach that's more aligned with some of the industry standards out there that takes into account priority raw materials that might not be a component to principal products, but may be used in smaller quantities, but still represent significant risks and opportunities. So our anticipated research would be to look across the various definitions of some of those key terms, understand if companies are using those terms or maybe defining them in a different way, and then determine whether or not we should make revisions to those terms in our standards.
It does seem like in other standards we have referred to critical minerals and critical materials, I guess. So that may be something that you're suggesting that we would potentially include in here. A related concept.
Correct. And what I think might be happening is that companies are using the mechanism for identifying priority raw materials through their reporting through other channels, and then just utilizing that information and kind of dropping it into their SASB disclosures. And it's unclear whether they're using the same definitions to compile both of those disclosures. So on one hand, we understand that they're trying to optimize their reporting, and these are very similar metrics. However, there are discrete differences between the two that we may be able to better align with.
Taylor, in your comment there about priority raw materials may not be aligned with industry accepted terms, and we're still using the words priority raw materials. Given that item in one, did you learn that there actually are other industry accepted terms that aren't using the words priority raw materials?
From my initial research, I find that the term is the same, but the definition is different.
And then on the feedback that we received, would you recall, is the company or the NGO, or were they in the US or outside the US?
Outside of the US, working with companies globally.
Thank you.
The second piece of feedback that we've received has come from two companies and an assurance provider, and that relates to the technical protocol, providing guidance that is inconsistent. The metric title is asking for the percentage of raw materials that are certified to a social or environmental standard, while in the technical protocol, we provide examples and refer to certain standards. And some of those standards don't necessarily fit into a clear bucket of certifying raw materials. Sometimes they certify a process or a finished product, which obviously makes the calculation of this particular metric challenging. And so therefore it creates some confusion with companies and insurance providers. So we'd be looking to look at those standards that we've referenced, ensure that we're using the correct ones that make sense, and then revise accordingly.
So was the feedback on this one basically that this maybe should be pointing to percentage of finished goods certified?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I haven't heard that feedback yet. We're still focused on raw materials. However, that's something we could look into.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Taylor, on the between the first and the second, so the first one relates to the sort of qualitative disclosure,
Mhm.
right, on priority, and this one relates to the technical protocol on the actual metric of percentage of raw materials. So they're just completely different. You know, are they related at all in any way, or are they just, is it really just two different pieces of feedback on two different metrics?
In terms of how the feedback is different between the two metrics.
Is priority, I guess, let me ask you more specifically, is the squishiness around priority raw materials at all impactful into the metric?
Mhm.
Or is it unrelated to?
That's a very good observation. Currently in the standard, we do not have any language in the technical protocol in this metric regarding priority raw materials. So that may be something we want to revise and add guidance on.
Seems a little odd that we would sort of ask for all raw materials after having focused on priority raw materials.
Yes, I think that companies are probably assuming that in the previous metric, we're talking about priority raw materials, but we're not specific in the quantitative metric. So that is another opportunity that we could clarify on.
Taylor, on the feedback received in both cases, did you simply get feedback that this wasn't right, or feedback as to what their suggestions might be?
We have only, the feedback that I've received so far is just that this isn't correct. For example, their like blue sign is a standard that we reference, and they certify finished products and production systems. The Better Cotton Initiative, which is listed here, is also unique in that they use a mass balance system, which technically doesn't certify that a particular certified cotton is actually in the end product. So far, it's just been that it's incorrect.
And those commenters identified themselves, or were they anonymous?
So far, they've been anonymous.
Thank you.
So moving on to the final piece of feedback that we've received on these two metrics, come from two companies, and that is that the calculation portion of the metric doesn't provide specificity on integration of a waste factor or loss rate and how to measure weight of finished products. Like I mentioned earlier, there are industry standards that are intended to standardize these two things, which we may look to as a guide to help improve our own guidance. So the research we would be doing here is looking at those standards, understanding if there are any barriers to using them or any challenges, if they're widely used and accepted by companies in the industry, and then determining whether we should further align with those standards.
Could you talk a little bit about, for example, the Corporate Fiber and Materials Benchmark Program?
Yes, that is a program produced by the Textile Exchange, which is a global nonprofit. And they have consulted with companies across the world to develop it. And there are currently 170 companies that are reporting to the benchmark. And they provide a lot of guidance, and there already is some alignment between the two. So I'm interested in looking into that as a potential path forward.
Is it, just to help me understand it a little bit better, So as a benchmarking program, it seems like it seems a little bit out of the scope of what we try to focus on in terms of disclosures around activity. If it's benchmarking, it seems more in the domain of helping the market to sort of understand ranking or ratings in a sense. So you do help me just understand a little bit more about the fact that companies are reporting around this. Is this something that they have to pay for, sign up for, or to what extent is the information disclosed already publicly disclosed, or is it, and to the extent that you have answers to this, or is it sort of the data housed within this program and it's more of just the rank that is provided externally?
So I'm still learning about the program as well, but there are two aspects to it that I understand. One is the benchmark, the other is the material change index. And as a part of those two programs, companies report information related to their preferred fibers. And one component of that is looking exactly at the percentage of which are certified to a certain standard. So the inputs to those two programs are directly aligned with what we're doing. Regarding whether companies have to pay to participate, I don't know the answer to that.
Or the public availability of the inputs that go into it?
There are scorecards on the Textile Exchange's website, but the granularity of the data is unclear to me at this point.
Just something to think about to the extent, because it can help us to understand whether, if we were to align with aspects of the inputs, the extent to which companies are maybe already in a position to publicly disclose, if it's already being publicly disclosed. That would help us understand that. I think one of the big questions I have over all of this is it seems like there's a lot of industry activity around this topic. It seems like there is interest in it, but one thing that I'm not seeing very clearly here is kind of the links to financial impact. And so thinking about the extent to which corporate activity in this area actually does have impacts on operating performance or a financial position. So any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Well, I think that, so this project specifically is not looking at the financial materiality of the topic, which we've already discussed and have evidence to support. Rather, we're just focused on the measurement of that financially material topic.
Yeah, okay.
Anything you want to add?
Really a scope question. We're very intentionally proposing a scope that's focused squarely on measurement and not at the topic materiality level.
Okay.
Really based on the strong basis we already have for materiality for the topic.
It wasn't that this was immaterial. It was that we're mismeasuring or we're loosely measuring it and resulting in non-comparability.
Exactly.
Is it accurate to say that the industry has coalesced, since the standard was created, it seems like the industry has coalesced around some metrics in a way that maybe wouldn't have been apparent a couple of years ago? Is that a fair way to characterize it?
I think so. And there are still a lot of challenges associated with the supply chain and tracing materials. So it's been a long process that I think the industry is working towards very actively. And this is one manifestation of that progress.
I haven't thought through this completely, but when you think about the changes that might be proposed here, are they really changes in the standard, or are they a clarification in terms of, better explaining how you calculate the item, and the item is really, which is the standard, is not changed. So that's just something to think through. So I know we're proposing this as a standard change, and we want standard changes to go through our rules of procedure and always have public comment. We also want to make sure that it truly is a standard change and not a clarification of the standard.
Let me maybe phrase that a different way. To what extent would a change in the items that we're suggesting lead to existing companies that are reporting on this to maybe do things differently, or that the things that they're doing might then suddenly now align with what we're doing?
Well, I think that this standard setting project, some of it is very technical and just has to do with clarifying and correcting things. But there are nuances to that I think are sensitive to the industry. And I want to make sure that we're taking a very diligent approach to making those decisions intentionally and not changing the definitions of things in a way that is at odds with the industry or with the investor perspective.
You want to talk a little bit about what your plan is then to do that?
Yes. So estimating that this project will take between 6 and 12 months. I've listed out the key phases here, which are probably all familiar to you all. The key resources would be myself. I would lead the project working with the Standards Board, the Sector Committee, the SAG, and all of the other companies that we can engage. So again, I have discussed the problem here and am recommending that we approve this standard setting project, which aims at revising and clarifying the 2 metrics underneath the raw materials sourcing topic in the apparel industry.
Can you go back to this previous slide for just a second? So I know these are the normal key phases that we might go through. Could you talk a little bit about company investor, like the consultation part, like what some of your initial thoughts would be on that? And I'm particularly interested in the investor side, actually. What thoughts around how you might engage investor feedback on this and yeah, what the plan is there.
I'm sure I will continue to evolve that thinking, but right now, one of the key things I'm thinking about is the discussion on priority raw materials, because while we take a very defined approach, if we were to expand that definition and align with some of the other terms out there, it may expand the scope of disclosure to include materials that are used in much smaller quantities. So I don't want to add additional reporting burdens on companies if it's not of interest to investors. So while we may be able to further align with an industry standard and create certain efficiencies there, if it's not important to investors and they're happy with our current definition, there may not be a need to revise the definition. So that's one way I'm thinking about that.
That seems particularly important when I think about the existence already in our standards in some industries around critical materials. It's, you know, their ability to manage the process related to getting things that they need for their process. It's not about the sustainability of those critical things. It's actually about the ability to access it and manage that. So understanding how that might roll into investor interest here, I think, you know, would be very helpful in understanding the importance of scope on this particular topic.
I might add that it's particularly important because some of the initiatives in the industry are not necessarily designed with investors or capital markets in mind. Not to say they couldn't have usefulness for investors or capital markets, but we really need investor input to help inform our approach to constructing a useful metric and approach for measurement.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Before diving into more questions or hearing more comments from the board, Taylor, can you briefly jump back to slide 12? This relates to the topic, oh, sorry, I think it's the third slide in your segment, the agenda prioritization slide.
Oh, sure.
So just want to really directly address this because I think it'd be likely that board members would have questions on agenda prioritization. Of course, our agenda priorities were directed directed by the board. In discussions in creating the priorities, the board also encouraged staff to take a portfolio management approach to the set of projects that we're working on at any one time. And so some of the things we think about in terms of that portfolio management approach are across these 11 categories. I would specifically point to right now how we have 7 projects currently underway. None of the current projects have originated out of these red categories in the same way that we see here. Similarly, our kind of the earlier slide, 5 roadblocks towards implementation. One of those roadblocks might be a technical roadblock. Again, none of our currently approved projects directly originated out of trying to resolve concerns or issues related to that technical roadblock. On top of all of that, we want to continue to be responsive to the market really regardless of priorities, or factor that into our priorities while acknowledging kind of resource constraints and time and resource requirements in executing projects. And so kind of specifically citing that we have a few rather complex, longer time scale projects on the agenda right now. An example is the human capital project. Another example might be the content moderation project. I think we view something like this project, much more narrower in scope, more feasible on a shorter time scale, as perfectly appropriate to helping ensure that we have an effective portfolio management approach here. So unless there are any questions or comments on that, you can jump back.
If I can just say, I mean, I think that's helpful. This is really the main reaction I had to this proposal was, I mean, there's so many potential things we could be doing. It's kind of striking to see a project where the two arrows are pointing down on our priority list. But I do take it that there's kind of an overwhelming or overriding element of being responsive to things that we're hearing from particular industries.
Yeah. Lower priority doesn't necessarily mean that it's unimportant or that it won't get done. It just means that, you know, relative to the cost of engaging in it, we want to think about whether that's important. But this seems to be also a relatively low cost endeavor, I guess, in terms of the time commitments, both resource hours and horizon.
And it sounds like there is, the issue may be narrow, but there's deep interest in the particular industries that are affected by this question, which would be persuasive to me.
Certainly, and I didn't mention this, but the quantitative metric on the percentage of raw materials that are certified to a standard is actually a frequently occurring metric. So while this project is limited to the apparel industry and these two metrics, we may find through this process that there may be opportunity to improve the other frequently occurring metrics. I don't know, but that is a potential opportunity to kind of expand the value of this project.
Have you identified at all yet a relevant industry group that could help us by getting feedback?
The group that I've interacted the most with is currently the Textile Exchange, which isn't a perfect industry group, but they do work with, I think they have 110 members, so more or less similar.
Are there other comments from the board? Do we know if Elizabeth has been able to join us online? Elizabeth, are you there? Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can. Welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Do you have any thoughts or questions that you'd like to ask on this?
No, not on this. I think this was well presented. It makes sense to me, and look forward to seeing the follow-up. Thanks.
Great. Other thoughts from my fellow board members?
I think the comment you made, I think you made it, is that kind of while we're at it, so you've gotten feedback on these two standards. You're going to be going through a process of identifying relevant parties to talk with. This might necessitate an additional standards project approval, but just maybe internally a little cross-check. Hey, we got feedback on these, as we would step back in our own mind. Is there anything else within these standards that we'd like to sort of take advantage of the group and, you know, and ask about? So just might think through that. I know it's very focused. I know that's good, and you might decide that's all we want to do because everything else is good. But you just might go ahead and look at your other standards to see if you can take advantage of the input we're going to get.
I think we'll think about, you know, obviously you want to avoid scope creep, stay in your lane. But this is part of the consultation that will happen as part of this effort will be part of the process that informs our general research and screening for potential projects to improve the standards. So that does make a lot of sense.
I will just add one more thing. I think this is a really strong proposal because, like I said, we already have a number of companies in the industry that are reporting using the SASB standards. So there's been pretty good adoption. And I think that the apparel industry is really open to having these conversations. So it's a very active, engaged group. And I think if we can engage them even further and continue to encourage adoption and improve the standards, then it will be a good win.
Thanks.
I'll just say that I think this was a very good example of how stakeholders can engage with us, bring things to our attention that cause us to think about how we can improve the standards for everybody's, for everybody's benefit. While at the same time, we're trying to get investors to use it and companies to adopt it. We want to have a stable platform, but allow for changes where things like this exist. I do think the fact that there are companies that are actually reporting under what we have today creates probably for the first time an issue that you might not have faced before, which is how do you transition from the old to the new if we end up actually changing the standard? And so that'll be something new for us to sort of work through.
Great. If there are no other comments, I guess I'll remind everybody that's listening in that we add projects to our standard setting agenda through majority board approval. So with that, I'll ask if there's a motion to approve the standard as proposed above. So moved. Is there a second? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Elizabeth, was that
That was an aye.
Thank you. Just to be sure on that. Great. So with that, I'll thank Taylor for her presentation of that and look forward to hearing updates from her as that project moves along. Next, we're going to move to a proposal related to supply chain management in the tobacco industry. And for that, we have one of our analysts, Lynn Chia, here. So I will ask Lynn to introduce herself as well and walk us through that. Welcome, Lynn.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. My name's Lynn and the lead analyst on the team and specifically overseeing the food and beverage sector. Today, this presentation for the standard setting project will be one of two food and beverage projects that will be proposed to the board for consideration. After our lunch break, our associate analyst on the team, Devin, will also be speaking to all of you on a research project proposal we're looking at. So just kind of take the two in consideration together. So specifically right now for the standard setting project we're looking at, it's not a topic that's new to the board. We have actually looked at supply chain management for our tobacco industry standards previously. However, I did want to surface this again because we have continually received market feedback specifically on the lack of this topic in our standards. So want to revisit it with the board along with some additional regulatory and market developments on the topic. And also we'll walk through today what are the key issues and then what kind of feedback and historical considerations we've had around the table here to see what the appropriate next step may be. So similarly, as we just had the discussion around the previous project proposal, I did want to pause here around the research agenda prioritization because it is always a question. Tobacco is not the largest industry, does not represent the largest market cap or number of company issuers when we look at across our 77 different industry standards. However, this is looking at an emerging issue, a new issue for our standards. The issue itself is not necessarily new. And I think from the perspective is also when we think about each industry standards, are we also considering all the topics that are financially material to that industry as well? So I think want the board to just keep that in mind and also factor in some of our discussions around when we look at an entire portfolio of projects for each sector and across our sectors. Continue, of course, this conversation after the discussion. So for the tobacco industry, just to familiarize people with it, there's really four main stages when we think about the traditional tobacco product. It begins with farming and curing of the tobacco leaves. It gets then moved to the producers that produce products like cigarettes, cigars, etc. And then moves on to the consumer phase where you consume the product and then ultimately also a end-of-life waste step. When we look at our current tobacco standards, there are 2 topics, so a very lean standard. 2 topics are identified as public health and both marketing practices. They fall under our social capital dimension, so looking at how a company's operations and their products really contribute to society and impact society. Both of these certainly are financially material topics that are recognized by businesses in the industry. However, when we look at this other stage in that life cycle, the farming and curing, there are also some sustainability issues that are recognized as risks within the industry. So first on the left, there are 2 main environmental risks when you look across academic papers as well as different market and company reporters in this space. One is around ecological impacts of agrochemical use in growing tobacco. It is a fairly pesticide and fertilizer intensive crop. So there is significant impacts left, especially when more and more growing is evolving into more developing countries where some regulations and stringency may be lacking in the growth process. And second element is deforestation. It is generally a topic I am hearing a lot across different interests around the food and beverage sector. As this pertains to tobacco specifically, it's deforestation that occurs mostly for harvesting wood for the curing process, so for firewood. As far as the actual impact on clearing land for new growth, we're not seeing that as much, but lots of activities around the firewood use. Turning more to, I think, the side where you hear more around the industry these days on sustainability issue are the social elements. Child labor and also forced labor is a pretty prominent issue in the industry. There is a recent 2019 UK legislation brought on by human rights lawyers on behalf of the entire country of Malawi around child labor issues there. In turn, actually US has completely banned all import of Malawi supplied tobacco at this current point as that legislation moves forward. So this is something that the tobacco industry, companies within it are monitoring because it is materially affecting their supply chain, how they can source to different parts in the world. The 2 other elements are more occupational hazards for the different laborers in tobacco supply chain. One is the exposure to agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, again, health risks, both respiratory as well as through dermal exposure. And then the second one is a very unique one to this industry, which is green tobacco sickness. Nicotine exposure to actually physical and dermal handling of tobacco is actually as potent, I think, for a worker as smoking 50 cigarettes a day. So this has been an issue that's been tracked for this occupation as far as from standards, labor side on how to mitigate that for workers in that set.
Yeah, and just before you go on there, so this is the focus on farming and curing, but could you talk a little bit about the value chain integration within the industry?
Sure. So right now, farming and cure, so within the manufacturers, there are really 5 big players worldwide. I think there will be common names many of you will be familiar with in, Philip Morris, Altria, more US, Japan, British American Tobacco, and of course China's own tobacco group. So while that is very concentrated, the farming and growing part of the value chain is very, very scattered. So immense number of farmers worldwide, I think in over 100 or 120 countries grow the crop. And right now the manufacturers typically work with the farmers through direct contracts or even more so through contracts through a leaf distributor. So a couple of big leaf distributors, Universal being one of the biggest ones. But these contracts, as far as with the manufacturers, it's still them signing on, I think, the actual guarantee side. So there is actually, compared to a lot of other different agricultural value chains, a lot more influence from the tobacco manufacturers. It's generally, I think, from speaking with our sector standards advisory group member from Philip Morris, there's more and more movement away from general purchase of tobacco leaves from auctions for the big manufacturers because of the lack of traceability and origin information for them. They're moving more towards more of these contracts through distributor and directly with farmers. So along with just kind of the different issues we're aware of in the supply chain, there is recognition around the cultivation practices also through the global treaty, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control the WHO FCTC. This global treaty is adopted by over 180 parties, countries internationally representing 90% of the world's population. Is one of the largest global treaties that's been adopted through the WHO. And within it, there's about 20 or so articles, of which I've listed on the slide the two that are kind of directly relevant to the topic we're talking about today. Article 18 specifically recognizes that all the parties agree to have due regard to the protection of the environment and health with respect to tobacco cultivation and manufacturing. And then 17 kind of relates to the issue we've been talking about, as it requires parties to promote and appropriate economically viable alternatives for tobacco workers, growers, and sellers. And it ties into that is it needs to also have the viability of that land to switch over potentially to other crops, or those that are current tobacco farmers to be able to pursue these other economically viable alternatives. So when we talk about the occupational illness that has lasting damage, when you think about the ecological impacts, it also throws in some of these questions and they link together. I did want to note that the entire FCTC body of articles is also integrated under the SDG Goal 3 around health. So within that specific list that all countries or parties working towards the SDG should also consider the FCTC. As far as current status, fully just honest, is these two articles are not the priority focus areas for within the 20. I think a lot has been similar to our standards, focus on public health, marketing to youth around the public health use of tobacco. But within just the last 2 years, there's been the first step of a convening task force specifically within the FCTC on looking at these two articles and how to move forward. So while no kind of like direct party level regulations really are pervasive, it's a topic they started outlining the first steps on how to see to further address. And furthermore, as mentioned earlier, there's been more country level and individual case regulatory activities around, especially the social element, child labor components of the supply chain. And finally, I did want to note is that the investor community, I think, also do recognize tobacco supply chain as a risk when they are looking at investments in this industry. In May 2017, there was a UNPRI investor statement issued on World No Tobacco Day. And while a lot of it, of course, was commitment, mostly through the pensions and the insurance on kind of a divestment from tobacco, there was one element noted also by the managing director of the PRI that, aside from the obvious health issues, investors are increasingly becoming aware of material financial risks around tobacco, specifically calling out supply chain risks within that. I know the topic of divestment comes up quite a bit when we talk about the industry. There's a lot of discussions or media coverage on the divestment of companies from this industry. Just from some preliminary research and also talking with our standards advisory group member, is absolutely true. When you look at pensions and these long-term investment vehicle like that space, there is divestment movement. But then when looking at the institutional investors, looking at the top 5 holdings of the 5 big tobacco companies, you will see all the familiar global institutional investors still in the space. So I think for me, part of the research as a next step is looking into that, how big does this actually play out? But currently, at least evidence doesn't suggest that this is a space that all investors are completely moving away from. So we'll pause kind of there. This is more the current state of this issue. And then we'll shift gears into looking at how we at SASB have considered this topic. So if there aren't any questions, proceed, but I'll see if there's any questions so far.
Just one follow up on that last point you made, thinking about current interests from investors on this in particular. I think in particular on the supply chain aspect of it, because I mean that's really, we know historically some investors have moved away from investing in tobacco, not just for supply chain reasons, I suspect. And so understanding that particular aspect of it will be
and I think as we go through some of the feedback we received in the past, you'll see that there's been handful of different comments from investors specifically on this piece and the angle they see it. So maybe we can go through that, and then if there's further questions, I can continue to elaborate. But I absolutely agree with you. One part of this project, if it is approved, is digging into that further. You know, what is that, this supply chain piece in this financial consideration? Yeah. So this topic has actually been with SASB since the beginning of the creation of the food and beverage sector standards. This was actually part of our exposure draft of the provisional standards issued in 2015, an environmental and social impact of supply chains topic with 2 metrics, one focused on the agricultural aspect and then the other more looking at audit, so linking a little bit over to the labor as well as environmental elements. In mid-2015, after the public comment period on this exposure draft, we did decide at the time to withdraw this topic given the, I think, lack of material information that was found on it at that time by staff. So this was our staff decision at that point based on our evidence then. But since then, we continue to receive stakeholder interest around this topic and consultation. So this is a phase from 2016 to 17 when we were talking with companies, investors, market around our development of the provisional standards. 2016, it was consultation with an asset manager that companies should be disclosing broader social and environmental issues that are part of the tobacco supply chain. Specifically, the asset manager cited forced labor, agricultural practices, and tobacco, green tobacco illness as topics for consideration within this broader issue. January 2017 was one of our earlier continued engagements with Philip Morris International as an issuer in this industry. They also held the view that all tobacco companies should demonstrate that they have assessed environmental and social impacts across their value chains. They proposed an even broader set of different topics and impacts to discuss within the supply chain, from child labor and forced labor, and actually also around waste management and some other emissions related topics. And then March 2017 consultation, we were speaking with a few investment analysts more broadly across agriculture as a whole. And the theme of origin and transparency really stood out in that consultation. So not necessarily just specific tobacco, but all agriculture, is that they cited more of this origin transparency information is very helpful for investors. And then tobacco, they cited the pesticide use and actually some changing climate and water stress issues in that.
So specifically on the water stress, I mean, I seem to remember the discussion around, there was some discussion around the role of water in the tobacco industry. And it seemed like, and related to climate actually, and our assessment at the time was that because tobacco doesn't use as much water, because it grows in a lot of different places, that we weren't seeing a clear link or hearing from investors that there was those aspects of it. I guess this consultation suggests to me some investor-related interest in supply chain issues for tobacco. And I don't think we ever really, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember hearing from investors that they weren't interested in this. But that's sort of a weird thing for investors to come out and say, don't tell us about that. Mm-hmm. So we do look for where they are asking actively around certain topics, but also making the link to financial impact. And so seeing, through our standard lenses, affecting revenues, cost structure, risk, cost of capital type of issues. Do you feel like that link has been made in your mind, or we're hearing from investors that they want to know about it, particularly because the way it relates to assessments around the financial position of a company or operating performance?
Yeah, I think that link has started to come through more in the continued conversations that are happening in this. So I think there's 2 specific examples. If I continue on, one from Deutsche Asset Management, and then also a very recent conversation with Philip Morris International, as actually they heard about kind of SASB's work and looking at this topic again, their feedback on this. So I can jump over there. I'll go over here really quickly, but Deutsche Asset Management, so now DWI, they published their own ESG report around tobacco investment returns and societal costs, and had a section specifically focused on why they view supply chain risks, especially pertaining to agriculture and social issues, as a big risk, I think, in their investments, and looking at it from an investor on this issue. So they talked about that there's a need to develop disclosures regarding social environmental standards in cultivation and processing. There's very large externalities broadly in the space, and citing back to that PRI letter and additional work, that they see investor interest and engagement around this as they manage the risks. And then the last part is really more also citing to just more, this was the regulatory pieces that came out around Modern Slavery Act, California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, that came out, I think, in mid 2015-16 range, that targets specifically the slave labor. So from them, it really was from a risk angle, financial impact. And I think that's been echoed by Philip Morris' recent discussions on when they look at this UK legislation again, looking at US's regulatory reaction is we will ban any, Malawi imports from the United States market while things remain unknown. I think that's,
I mean, just in simple terms, there's evidence now that investors take these issues into account in making decisions about investment in tobacco companies that apparently didn't exist in 2015 when we considered this.
Or maybe,
Before.
I think that's what I would like to see more evidence of. I mean, it's one thing to say you can't import from certain countries, but understanding that then creates real risks for the manufacturers out there. I mean, if there are, economically, usually when you have very small suppliers, then you just move. There's not an infinite number of them, but if there are many of them, it may not be that costly. You're already managing a whole bunch of different suppliers. So
yeah, and
but it may be that this that creates real problems for companies, and understanding the extent to which they're talking about having to manage that, or seeing that it has implications for the manufacturers. I think would be evidence that supply chain we see it having an impact on the financials of companies.
Well, and you have new regulation, that was not there when the standards were being put forward. So there are financial consequences that might not have been there. And these were originally contemplated.
But, understanding what those financial consequences might be, it's, I think you've done a great job of conveying some of the investor interest. And it's just because this is a new topic and one that we've twice looked at before, I think just making sure that we're not going to add it to our agenda only to decide that when we really look out, investors aren't particularly interested, and pull it one more time. So I'm maybe a little more reluctant at this point to feel like we've met all four of the criteria we would normally look for, but you might be much more confident that we have met the four criteria we would normally look at for moving forward with the standard setting project. And I think it's a very interesting one, and I definitely think we need to consider it more, but that's one on there.
Can I add?
Please, Elizabeth.
Sorry. Hi, Elizabeth. Sorry, it's hard to interrupt without raising my hand. I tend to agree with you, Jess, in the direction that you were going. When I was reviewing this, I was trying to remember back to 2015 when we were first looking at the supply chain issues across this sector. And if I can't remember exactly, but so don't quote me on this, but if I remember correctly, we sort of decided to pull supply chain considerations from a number of the different industries in the sector. For reasons I won't pretend to remember at the moment. I do tend to think that revisiting some of the supply chain questions makes sense today, but maybe it's broader than tobacco. I mean, I think there's a good case here for why there are a lot of risks in the tobacco supply chain, but a lot of the risks that I'm seeing are also relevant to other type of agricultural products as well. So if we're going to spend the research time to really take a look at this topic, maybe it makes sense to throw a more holistic net on this and think beyond tobacco, and maybe that increases the the value of the time that would be spent here.
Are you thinking specifically of the slave labor dimension there?
Slave labor, yeah. So, you know, things like commodities like sugar or, yeah, you know, I'm not an expert in this topic, but yeah, slave labor for sure, agrochemicals use, human sort of labor conditions and safety related to application of agrochemicals and that sort of thing, right? There are a bunch of issues there that aren't just relevant to tobacco that I think are worth taking a look at.
And I do think that like the green sickness is an industry specific aspect of that, which would sort of highlight why
Right.
you have an industry specific lens to some things that come across many related industries. So that's all fine. But I agree with your point, Elizabeth, on this being potentially a bigger issue to understand that we could understand before moving forward with the specific.
So a short comment on the supply chain aspect, more broadly thinking, is one, this is a very active conversation at the staff level, thinking about supply chain more broadly speaking. One of the challenges is it gets really, really complicated as that scope grows. As we grow, not just to other industries within food and beverage, we spread to consumer goods industries, we spread to the technology and communication sector. It gets really, really complicated really fast in terms of that not just scope creep, but kind of spiraling out of control. The reality is that when we come back to it, these are extremely industry specific issues. Not to say that we should not have a lens of consistency across industries where it's appropriate, where it's value adding, but these are at the end of the day extremely industry specific issues. So our general approach thus far, which we're open to input on, has been to continue to evaluate supply chains in various forms and manifestations and consider various aspects of groupings across industries, across sectors, across metrics. But we would be very, very reluctant to try to bite off a supply chain across all 77 industry standards type of research project. I think that would have too far-reaching of objectives and too broad of a scope. Kind of bringing back to how we got comfortable at the staff level of the right way for in the immediate future is to approach this on an industry specific level, while, like I said, continue to evaluate and have more market input, consultations, conduct more research around other types of groupings that we can explore. But again, open to input and alternative views on that. Maybe just one other last point. Just really want to be clear that what Lynn is laying out here, what really the staff got comfortable with, is that these inputs suggest that this project is important enough to add to our agenda, not that this is a material topic. That's what we want to go and answer. So we don't have any foregone conclusions that it is in fact a financially material topic for the industry. So there is I shouldn't say a likelihood, but there is a risk that we could add a project to our agenda, at the end of the day, come away with a very strong conclusion and very strong basis that could point in either direction, that it is in fact a financially material topic based on evolving investor views, the regulatory nature and changes that we've seen over the last few years. But the alternative could take place as well. And then at least we can be very clear with the market and communicating to our advisory group and communicated to companies in the industry and the capital markets why we've concluded that at this time we don't have an adequate evidence basis for the materiality of it.
So I really appreciate the context there. That's very helpful, especially in understanding the scope issue with respect to interest. When I think of the 4 criteria, you know, I don't think that we need to have everything nailed down before we move to a standard setting project. That's fine. But when you think of like what the standard's going to involve, typically it's like a topic, a metric, and then the supporting details around that. And it's hard to get metrics that are going to meet our criteria to be, you know, representative of performance on a particular issue, and then to write words around that are going to be the right words. And that's all of what standard setting involves. But before we get to that stage, you know, I think knowing that we've actually met the primary things of, you know, trying to facilitate a communication between investors and companies on material issues. You know, to me, if you just do the topic, you could tie the topic broadly to financial interest, and that there was financial impact, and there's investor interest in it. I think the investor interest I'm coming around on, but there are many different types of investors in the marketplace, and so knowing that, like seeing that there's links to it, to the financial impact, then I think we can work on identifying the right metrics, having the words to support comparable disclosure on those metrics as part of a standard setting project. But I think we could actively signal to the market with a research project on this that we are trying to figure out what are the financial implications of not managing this particularly well, or being able to actually manage it well. I may be the only one on that, but.
Well, unfortunately, in this industry, I think there are other industries where that materiality link has been clearly established, in the apparel industry and a few others. Tobacco is a different kind of product, precisely because of the dependency of the customer. And so the revenue risk may be different, but again, that seems like something that would bear investigation rather than making an assumption up front.
Yeah, I mean, there was some sorry, I don't commit. So there was some discussion around the taxes that could be levied on companies, but to your point, like understanding the extent to which they just generally sort of pass that through, and the extent to which it actually eats into demand and then profits, and would be helpful. I mean, it's a complicated issue, but Stephanie.
I think one element of materiality that we look at is investor interest and whether they would make a decision based on that piece of information. And so the fact that we've received proactive, high quality feedback from not just investors, but also manufacturers and regulators, well, not feedback from regulators, but evidence of regulatory interest. The fact that all three of those are pretty strong, I think weighs in favor of proceeding.
In terms of a discrete project to investigate this investor interest for this topic, and the good thing about the PRI letter is it includes investors from France, asset owners from France and other countries outside the US, where you might see some different interests in terms of ownership and products and holding figures outside versus inside the US. But having that global scope of investors would be an opportunity, because the PRI letter doesn't really focus on the supply chain element. It says we agree with the general principles of the WHO initiative, but if you could go to those specific investors and ask them, would this particular topic make a difference to you? Would you be, would it offset the other two topics, for example, if stronger supply chain management issues that make you more likely to hold a tobacco stock, for example?
Are you suggesting, Barry, or maybe were you suggesting, Jeff, that this should be a research project rather than a standard setting project?
I mean, I could certainly see, in the June meeting coming back saying, here's a bit more detail around that, and it hasn't even really slowed the project plan generally. But before, the way Lloyd sort of said it is that putting it to a standard setting project to me suggests that we've sort of opined on the materiality of it, which isn't to say that due process wouldn't change our opinion about that if that's what the research suggested, but what the outreach suggested. But if we're not sure about that, I think there's plenty of reason to continue to think about it before we actively signal to the market that we're going to try to propose something because we've made a conclusion around the importance of the topic.
So I literally had in my notes, did you consider research and not standard setting project? Because we're still trying to link those things. I actually think they're there. I could probably make the link in my head about where the costs are there, about the employees and the impact on society and what, I think that they're there and I think we'll find them, but so I wouldn't object either way, frankly, because I think that you'll find them by June, whether you do it under the auspices of a research project or you do it under the auspices of standard setting project. But I think, leading practice would be to try to have that already linked up. I happen to think that it's there, that you'll find it.
I guess my background is kind of the same for the reasons that Stephanie outlined, although I guess I could live with it on either basis.
But you're saying you will find it, it's not there right now.
I didn't see the link between, there's definitely investor interest, it's clear.
Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't see the link between the financial materiality that we spent 5 hours discussing in an offsite yesterday, and that's why it's all in my head. you know, to actually linking it directly to how this would impact the financial materiality.
If I can jump in, I think this ties back to Brian's point he made earlier, because it goes back to how we define these 4 criteria. Because what I'm hearing is that for a project, for a standard setting project, one of the criteria being in consideration is that we have demonstrated financial materiality, when as far as with staff, that is not the definition we're using on kind of like what's the threshold on if it's a standard setting project. Is really seeing the standard setting project as a vehicle to answer that question. So that's the part I want to make sure
I think said differently, framing this around the 4 criteria that we have established, and they're probably the relevant one being mission alignment.
Right.
We would represent that we view this as at least adequately, the input suggests that we've adequately met that criterion of mission alignment. Open to alternative views on that, but I think that's the way to orient ourselves on making that determination on adding it to the agenda or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much in coming up with when we're talking about adding a new topic and metrics to support that and the technical protocol. That's a pretty big undertaking in a sense, because there's a lot to get feedback on there, and it's not easy to write the words that are going to lead to that will lead to good disclosure around an important topic. But I would have preferred, again, like nothing is, we're not suggesting that we need 100% certainty, and we can always be surprised by the consultation process that follows as we go through due process related to standard setting. My own preference is that I would rather leave something at the research level until we're sure that for example, a new topic being added is something where we see strong evidence of financial impact as well as investor interest, before we move to trying to get into the weeds on exactly what we're talking about adding related to that.
I think what pushes me to agree with you is just the history here, that we've looked at it and kind of said we're not persuaded on materiality. So I think framing it as a research project of like, well, let's revisit that and see if the case is strong enough to present it as I think that's probably the right way to frame it, because there is a prior decision in place.
I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I feel like, I know we talked about research project versus standard setting before. And I thought when we talked about standard setting that it was not determinative of materiality or any element of creating a standard. Was it sufficiently far along? But I don't remember the specific criteria.
That's right. So it depends on what you mean by far along, but far along in terms of identifying that there's financial impacts. I think the investor interest is great, and if it's broad enough across types of investors, then I'm sure that evidence of financial impact is there.
Yeah, and if I can just chime in on that piece, I realized a couple other points PMI had mentioned just last week in chatting with them is more specifically, especially response to this child labor issue, which first of all it's not a Malawi specific one. It's pretty pervasive to all countries or many countries that's growing tobacco, and I think they're getting, as it shifts more to developing countries, it's a bigger issue within the industry. Is as a response to that, one of the competitors issued a proactive earnings call, or in their earnings call specifically brought up this topic proactively. They were not the one that was being litigated to discuss this with investors. I think another issued a statement within one of their investor disclosures around this topic in response. So the whole industry is definitely, it seems like they're recognition around this issue, and also addressing and disclosing to investors on it. And then the other point I haven't gotten to here, but it really, I think PMI brought this up and they thought it was important to think about, is tobacco companies are starting to shift away from the core cigarette products, right? It's still definitely their main revenue driver, but they're going more electronic, more these alternative products, which we cover in our standards. That all of a sudden brings a whole new scope of supply chain questions for them that is exactly the same as any of our technology communications industry standards. They said they use exactly the same suppliers that any of your, like at least PMI, that your different laptops, phones use same quality of standards, very similar supply chain. So for them, this is where supply chain is starting to elevate further for them as they're looking at the expansion of their product set. And it's different definitely for the different players where they are in that space, and no way is that, you know, a dominant force, but it's just another consideration in terms of from the issuer side.
That's very helpful, and I think what that does for me is emphasize even more that there's a lot to be understood in the tobacco industry around where there are going to be the links to investor interest and financial impact related to supply chain issues, because they are not necessarily typical of what's in other industries because of some of the uniqueness around it, and it's an evolving industry. And you know, it's again, this is really just, I think this is a question of whether we state that this is a standard setting project now or in June, it would be my guess, but when we go to saying it's a standard setting project, having a pretty clear sense that there's interest around certain aspects of supply chain, and then seeing if we've scoped it out at that point. But that's where I'm at.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think just to reiterate and maybe clarify a bit of what Brian said is the staff really view this as a standard setting project, given we understand within the standard exactly what we're pursuing to evaluate, which is the materiality of the topic, and if so, whether we need to then add the topic and associated metrics. So given that's structured in that way, it was proposed as a standard setting project, but fully understand where you're coming from, and that a piece of that standard setting project is the research around the materiality of the topic, and whether that's strategically better in a standalone research project that then concludes with a recommendation. Fully understand the views that you're sharing.
The other thing that informs, in my opinion on that, which is that you have the human capital project underway. And at least on the slave labor dimension, there seems to be significant overlap between that project and some of the questions you'll want to address here.
That's a good point. So maybe one way to say this is that you don't need standard setting board approval for doing research on this, and even publicly announcing this as a research project. And I think there's 100% support for from that perspective of doing that. But if you would like to propose that we add this to the standard setting objective, then we have to take a vote. And so if you would like the vote to be taken on that specific issue, we can take a vote on it. But you also don't have to. So that's up to. I'll put that actually to Brian.
We're happy to take the board's direction on it. I think conceptually we're all on the same page. That Lynn presented an extremely strong, robust case around the inputs, the numerous and substantial inputs that suggest that this is an important issue for us to evaluate. And so thanks to Lynn for diving into this and doing a lot of work and consultations and prior review of SASB's earlier work on the topic. And so point being, I think conceptually we're all on the same page that this is an issue we want to continue to move forward on. As far as the more tactical question on adding it to the agenda or asking for your direct approval, Jeff, to make sure that this is a research project that at the very least we can publish on our list of current projects on our website and signal to the market that this is an active issue on our research program, then we're happy to take the board's direction.
Look at it again in June. So I guess if there were going to be a motion to vote on it, then we would need a second for that as well. But again,
I think it's almost a semantic issue. I mean, basically, we either vote on it now or in June, right? Or I guess the third option is it's clearly not where we think it's going, but.
I think the next steps would be the same in either case. So we'd go investigate this, and I think the board is really open to hearing a more fully developed, aspect of the argument in June.
I think that this is in some sense really just semantics, because what we're going to ask Lynn and the other staff to really do is not really changing in the interim. It's stuff that would be part of that process anyway. But I know we're still in the first year of taking in, you can still count the number of projects that we've got underway on two hands. And so this is a little bit sort of just level setting in terms of, understanding where you're likely to get pushback on before we're willing to actually take a vote on something to move forward. And if we decide as a result of today that it's that we've sort of struck too far one direction versus the other, we can certainly continue to think about that going forward.
So maybe for clarity's sake, Jeff, what we will do, staff will do, is we're revising our recommendation to ask directly for your approval to put this, add this to our work program as a research project. We'll continue to move forward with it, engage with the market, conduct research, and hopefully come back to you in June.
Any comments on that from the fellow board members?
That feels good. I think, I keep going back to this low-hanging fruit thing where it would just be great to be tackling some of those things. We know there's clear support on both sides, companies and investors for doing this without the baggage of having looked and rejected some of those things. Feels good, like a good solution.
Agree with that.
Well, okay, so Elizabeth, any last thoughts on that?
No, nothing additional. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So with that, I'll thank Lynn for the work that you've already done in this project, and we are definitely looking forward to an update on this going forward, related to the research that you're doing on this, and suspect that we will be actively engaged in standard setting on this topic going forward, but not quite there just yet, but looking forward to more work on this. So with that, we'll go ahead and adjourn briefly for 30 minutes, and then we'll come back to look at one more proposal for a research project. So invite those who are online to come back within 30 minutes at a quarter to the hour, and we'll pick up again there. Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of our Standards Board meeting. I am Jeffrey Hales, Chair of the Standards Board at SASB, and in this afternoon portion of today's meeting, we are going to be talking about a proposal to look at alternative meat and dairy, and then after that, we will be diving into some agenda planning and discussion. I would note for our listeners and for those who are joining us today that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website afterward. And if you go to the calendar website, not only will you find the archive when it is posted there, but also the materials for today. This is a public meeting, but it's not interactive. And so if you do have questions or comments, I encourage you to submit those either through the webinar or through our public comment portal, recognizing that we won't have the ability to respond directly to comments today. But we will be logging those, and appreciate everybody joining us. So with that, we'll start with our first item for this part of the meeting, and we'll turn it over to Devin Bonney, who is going to be talking to us about alternative meat and dairy. I'd like Devin to introduce yourself and dive into the topic.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Devin Bonney. I'm an associate analyst on the research team, and I help cover the food and beverage sector along with Lynn. And today I'll be proposing a research project as it relates to alternative meat and dairy, as Jeff just mentioned. We've seen throughout the past few years that alternative meat and dairy products have grown significantly in the marketplace, and this is due in part to increasing consumer demand for products with reduced environmental impact as they become more aware of the impact that their diets can have on the environment. And we've also seen that companies are adopting strategies in relation to this changing consumer preference. And in looking at the SASB standards within food and bev, we found that there were no topics or metrics as it relates to alternative meat and dairy products. And therefore today we are seeking approval to initiate a research project to really understand how this trend fits into each of the food and beverage industries, how this consumer demand for products fits into the general issue categories within those affected industries, and then ultimately whether to proceed to standard setting activity. And looking at the criteria for standard setting projects, we have a few unknowns. However, the evidence I'll present today will speak to what we know about mission alignment and scope and prevalence. Those are not completely unknown. And capacity and feasibility I'll talk about further in the project overview later on in the presentation. In terms of our research agenda prioritization, this hits two high priority areas, including evaluating new or emerging issues, as well as alignment, which I'll speak about a little bit further when I talk about investor interest. So today I'll present the background evidence of how this is an emerging issue, how we can help potentially align with TCFD through this research project, our initial evidence of investor interest, as well as input that we've received thus far from the Standards Advisory Group, how this trend fits in and does not fit into the SASB standards as they currently stand, and then I'll go over the project. So going into the evidence, I first want to just level set on the type of products we're talking about today. So a study done by DuPont Health and Nutrition found that 65% of global consumers are eating more plant-based food and beverage products due to concerns related to health issues, animal welfare issues, and environmental issues. And plant-based products can really mean sort of three different set of products. One is truly plant-based, in which companies take a plant like soy and manufacture it to taste like meat. They can take yeast and undergo a brewing process to activate proteins, and that's the fermented piece to mimic meat or dairy. And then cell culture is relatively new, but that's when companies are taking animal cells and actually growing meat in a lab. So it's still meat, but you're removing the animal from the supply chain. And when we refer these products back to why consumers are switching, there's no consensus on whether these products are actually healthier. We know it will address animal welfare issues because you're removing the animal completely. And science has found through many different LCAs that these alternative products can significantly reduce the environmental impacts, specifically as it relates to land use, GHG emissions, and water use, specifically when we talk about meat and milk products, but we expect that this is true for a variety of other products in this category. And there are ranges here because it depends on if you're comparing traditional chicken to alternative chicken or traditional beef to alternative beef, and same with different milk. But the idea is that we have clear evidence that this can help reduce these 3 environmental impacts. And we've seen that there is growing consumer demand, especially as it relates to alternative meat. So this is a map of the protein alternatives market in 2018 globally. So this is not just a US-based trend, but rather one that's affecting many different regions. In the US, it was estimated that grocery store sales for these substitutes was roughly 750 million in 2019 and is expected to grow to 7.2 billion by 2025. And these are not vegan or vegetarian consumers, but the majority of which are omnivores switching to these products. And then in Europe, it was estimated that this market will reach 2.6 billion in 2024. And when we look at this globally, currently, the plant-based meat market is roughly 12 billion compared to the meat market, which is 945 billion. And that's expected to grow significantly over the next 10 years. So JP Morgan and Barclays analysts both agree that this will be between 100 and 140 billion market by 2029 and represent roughly 10% of the global meat market. And we've seen a similar trend in the alternative milk industry, specifically in the US. So a few years ago, between 2012 and 2017, alternative milk sales grew by 61%. At the same time, traditional milk sales declined by 15%. And by the end of that period, alternative milk had reached 10% roughly of the entire milk market in the US. And Dean Foods is a large US dairy producer. They filed for bankruptcy in 2019, and in their bankruptcy filing actually mentioned this is one of the causes for that bankruptcy filing, which indicates that this is not just consumer demand changing, but it can potentially have financial impact on companies. And we see that through companies adopting strategies related to this trend. So on the left-hand side, we have the SASB industries, and highlighted are the 5 that we've already seen companies in adopt strategies as it relates to these types of products. So for example, Tesco and Greggs and Kroger are all either doing R&D or partnering with other companies to add more plant-based options. In the meat, poultry, and dairy industry, we see disruptors like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, and then also traditional companies like Tyson adopting strategies related to this. In the non-alcoholic beverages space, there's a lot of acquisition as well as investment. So Califia Farms just got a $225 million of investment to grow their business. And they produce oat milk and other alternative milk products. Same with processed foods, and then restaurants. The most common one might be the Burger King Impossible partnership, but a lot of these companies are exploring strategies related to this. So now I've kind of covered how consumer demand is changing and how companies are adopting strategies. So I'll go into our initial evidence of investor interest, starting with TCFD. So TCFD has 3 implementation recommendations for their agricultural, food, and forest products group, one of which is developing new products and services with lower carbon and water intensity. And as I showed it through the LCAs, we know that these alternative products can help reduce carbon and water intensity, and therefore undergoing a research project will help us further determine if we can align better with TCFD. We also saw in 2019 that 3 different investors asked companies about their strategies related to alternative meat and dairy through earnings calls, which will further track in 2020 through this research project. And then another piece of investor interest is through FAIR. So FAIR is a nonprofit that helps investors be responsible stewards of capital, specifically as it relates to intensive animal production. And in 2016, they launched a sustainable protein engagement. And that first phase had 36 investors with roughly 1.3 trillion in assets under management. And in just 3 years, they launched phase 4, and that grew to 88 investors with almost 11.3 trillion in assets under management. So we've seen significant growth in investor interest. And what we're hoping to look into more through a research project is to really understand how disclosure on this topic could help be more decision useful to investors. Our last bit of evidence that we received is through the Standards Advisory Group. So we've done preliminary engagement with them through a workshop in December, followed up with individual phone calls. And we heard that from one food and beverage investor analyst They said that they think that this topic could be financially material, and they view companies adopting strategies related to these products can help mitigate risk and also create opportunity. One restaurant said that this trend was not a priority, but offering products for all of their consumers was a priority. One industry group wanted to engage with us on this topic, and one nonprofit currently working with investors is very eager to engage with SASB on this topic. So all of these inputs, the growing consumer demand, hearing companies adopt strategies, the initial investor interest, led us to look at where this topic stands within the SASB standards as they currently are. So if we look, again, these are the three reasons why consumers are switching. It's due to concerns related to health and nutrition, animal welfare, and the environmental impacts. And when we map this to what's already in the standards, we see that health and nutrition, there are 3 disclosure topics, or 3 industries have disclosure topics related to health and nutrition, and 3 industries have disclosure topics related to animal care and welfare, but that environmental impact piece of products is currently missing from our standards. And we've seen that companies are actively adopting strategies due to adopting these products in order to help reduce their environmental impacts. So for example, Starbucks just announced that they're going resource positive, and one of the strategies that they're using to do that is offer more plant-based options. And so we want to better understand if there is a gap in our standards and how we should be addressing that through this research project. So in looking at what the research project, we think we have initial evidence to support mission alignment through investor interest, but by engaging with investors, we'll be able to further determine how disclosure on this topic could be useful for them. But the real questions will focus around scope and prevalence. So again, how this affects those 5 industries we referenced, how this can fit into the general issue categories within those industries, and whether or not to proceed to standard setting. We believe we have capacities. We have both a lead analyst and associate analyst on the food and beverage sector. And for feasibility, we estimate this project to take 9 to 12 months. One of the reasons we expect it to take up to a year is because a lot of companies have just launched strategies. So for feasibility, we estimate this to take up to a year because companies have just launched strategies at the end of 2019 into 2020. And so being able to track this over a year will help us really determine how this will impact financial performance and give investors time to understand how they'll adopt it into their strategies. And we think that the outcome of this will be to better understand the industries, potential disclosure topics, and ultimately whether we have recommendation for standard setting in the future. So I'd like to open it up now to the board for discussion, specifically if based on initial evidence, you believe that this should be a project and warrants further research from the research team, and if the scope questions are the right focus for this project.
I guess if I can make an initial comment, and as a practitioner, this is one of the most difficult spaces that we work in, the food industry, the question of nutrition, impact on human health, carbon footprint. We don't have the benefit of a good standardized reporting framework. The companies tend to present the case as they frame it, which creates lots of work for ESG analysts. So I would say that there's no doubt a need in all 3 dimensions you mentioned for greater clarity if it could be achieved. So the need is certainly there.
I'm kind of curious about the conference calls because the questions are very interesting. I'm particularly interested in the company responses, actually.
Yeah, so the company responses were pretty non-committal in those investor phone calls. I think because companies have just started adopting strategies, they're not committing to expanding the product lines that they tested and expanding markets. And that's why we want to look at it now to really track it over 2020 to see how companies do respond to how they're and implement, give them time to implement strategies and understand how that affects their performance and what their strategies will be after 2020.
I think also you might not see anything here, but also looking at the subsequent analyst reports that came out for like these analysts or related analysts to see. They may not talk about it in their reports that come out after. Often, they're highly formatted to a particular way in which they do their reports, but that might also be interesting to see to what extent they think it's an issue in the shorter medium term in terms of being a driver of demand as well as stock price.
It's interesting to see the discussion of this in conference calls, just because one of the things I think about conference calls is that the sell side analysts on the conference calls don't necessarily always represent the vast majority of buy-siders. But the fact that you're actually getting sell side analysts asking on the calls indicates to me is a strong indicator of financial materiality, at least on the come.
Yeah.
I hope that this becomes a growing market, but so it sort of shows interest to me on that level in financial materiality.
Well, because it's a potential revenue driver. It's changing the product mix right now. To the extent that companies are not just talking about the need to do it, but have introduced some of these things, they're wondering, what is the contribution, and is it likely to stick around or grow? So definitely good companies hedging, not knowing what it's going to happen with consumer preferences and related. But I think this is all very helpful for starting to understand the issue.
Well, thank you for pointing out the Tyson Foods bankruptcy, that this goes both ways. Introducing new products is good, and being reliant on one product that may be losing share.
Yeah.
So it can be impactful on the whole industry, not just on the new entrants, for example.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, as you think about this, to what degree would the focus be on the newer products like Beyond Meat, or et cetera, versus what you might call legacy problems like high sugar content in carbonated beverages, et cetera?
I think we're focusing more on the meat and dairy product space as opposed to looking at this as a whole portfolio development project. We thought about that, but just thought the scope of that would be too big. And so really focusing in on these alternative products and how current companies are doing it, as well as disruptors, and how that impacts our standards. But it's certainly something we could consider as we do the research project.
It sounds like the TCFD recommendations, those are not well reflected in the standards now, that you have this whole environmental footprint dimension that we didn't really contemplate when we were finalizing the standards in 2018.
Correct.
Can I just correct one thing really quick? I think it was mistakenly said Tyson Foods bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah.
It was Dean Foods. Even I believe there's a secondary company, private equity owned dairy company bankruptcy recently as well, where I think this might have been mentioned as a factor, one of multiple factors that may have led to an insolvency.
And if you go to that slide that had the table of health, nutrition, animal welfare, and environmental impacts of alternative products, how are you thinking about investigating? I look at the kind of existing topics across the various industries, and they seem to be sort of broader scope of total portfolio of products, perhaps across. And in the third category of this environmental dimension seems to be focused on a few products potentially as either a disruptor in the industry or as a new category of revenue opportunity. So how do you think about that in terms of the scope of the project?
Yeah, so I think we wanted to anchor this project proposal around those two products. We have evidence of environmental impact, but that doesn't mean that we won't expand it to include other products. And I think ideally we would look at it beyond the product level and do a more holistic approach. And part of this research project could also be looking further into if these disclosure topics are appropriate given this trend as well. So we believe it will focus on the environmental impact, but evidence could suggest that we need to take an alternate route throughout the year.
So I'm wondering if, as Lloyd said, there's a real demand for understanding the environmental implications of companies in these various industries. It might be that it's beyond just a few disruptive products to figuring out more consistent ways to measure environmental impact.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be the ideal end state.
And then just to kind of piggyback on this a little bit, it's also that clarity in defining where the research project stops and a potential standard setting project may begin is once we can have more clarity around exactly what Verity you've asked, then it becomes more a question as standard setting project capacity of what are potential topics or metrics that they can manifest in. So I think that's where we're seen as a kind of a end goal state for the research project phase.
Elizabeth, not to put you on the spot, but if you do have any comments on this, I know food's one of your favorite topics, so I just thought I would invite you to weigh in.
No, I don't think I have anything that hasn't been raised already. It's a topic that I've been trying to wrap my brain around. Still think there's a lot of unanswered questions, so I think it's worth looking into, but nothing more thoughtful at this point.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Are there any other thoughts from board members? I mean, it sounds like we don't need to take a vote, but it seems like there's no concerns with continuing to do research on it and trying to sort out whether or in what capacity it makes sense to move forward with specific standard setting proposals. Guess I misinterpreted that. If not, thank Devin for her presentation and for your help on that, and you're looking forward to the progress that you're going to make on this going forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and with the remaining time that we've got in this last hour, we'll talk about our agenda for the existing projects that we have. And for that, I will turn it to David Carl.
Thank you very much. So we'll take just the last few minutes here to take a look at our current portfolio of projects. I'll provide some updates on behalf of the staff who are fortunate to have joining us here. So hopefully we'll represent their hard work accurately. And then we'll remind the board and the public of some of the early stage items that we're looking at that we haven't necessarily brought forward a formal project for. We reviewed some of those in the last meeting, but I'll remind ourselves of that, and then just do a quick look ahead towards our next board meeting in June. So here is our current project pipeline. So I'll briefly touch on the three items that we discussed today, just to review the decisions that were made. So for the tobacco supply chain project, we discussed that will be a research project, and we may look towards developing a plan that would include us providing you with a potential path forward around standard setting at the Q2 meeting this year. For the raw material sourcing project that Taylor presented this morning, that's been approved as a standard setting project, and as she mentioned, the duration there being somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And then, as we just discussed, we have a new research project as well that we've added to the agenda around alternative meat and dairy that Devin will be leading along with Lynn. So that adds to our project pipeline, as you can see from the start items there. And to briefly review what we currently have that's being worked on, I'll say just generally there's been a huge amount of progress on all of the projects that have been approved at the previous two meetings. And so I'm really just going to summarize some of the highlights and not go into all the detail on each of these projects. But I want to give the board and the public a little bit of insight into some progress that has been made. So starting at the top, for the systemic risk and asset management project, of course, the project was formally launched and currently is in the midst of a consultation phase. So there's been about 8 stakeholders engaged so far, and meetings are continuing to be scheduled. And sort of the strategy around stakeholders has been defined, and we're in the process of executing those engagements and gathering feedback per our project plan and per the discussion with the board in the meeting where that project was proposed. So the desire is to have an exposure draft available for the board at the next board meeting, so that'd be at the Q2 board meeting, and that would be targeting a 90-day public comment period. So that's the plan, but it will of course keep the board apprised. That's going to largely be dependent on what we find in consultation, and we'll let the board know before that meeting if we plan to bring that forward in that meeting.
I'm sorry, so board decision on that in Q2?
So potentially a board decision to initiate a public comment period in Q2. For tailing management and extractives, that's a project being led by Ekaterina. And so she initiated that project as well. did an extensive disclosure analysis. Part of that project was to understand the current state of disclosure on this topic, and she has completed that and is working on writing that up. She's also in the midst of her consultation and has engaged a number of organizations and standards advisory group members, and is reaching out to some initial important initiatives for additional consultation. As folks are aware, there's some international initiatives that are looking at this issue, and we're seeking to continue to engage with them to inform our progress on this process. We're also keeping the public up to date on what we're doing on this project and on others with blog posts to let them know that we're looking at these items and encouraging folks to engage with us. And so depending on the outcomes of the stakeholder consultation, Ekaterina is going to follow up with the board, representing the timing for a potential exposure draft, potentially targeting the Q2 meeting, but it's going to, again, depend on those, to some extent, on those external initiatives, which of course are following their own timelines in which we want to remain synchronized with.
David, is it fair to say that SASB staff is reaching out to a lot of industries and organizations and companies, but we always welcome others to reach out to the SASB to feed into the process?
Absolutely, thank you, Verity, and that's 100% the case. And we would, if you're looking for who to contact and how, please go to our website. We have a current projects page, and that includes the project manager for each project. Please reach out to the project manager if you'd like to engage with us on that project, and thank you for the reminder, Verity. Another active project and high priority research project for us, I'll just say that those were the two standard setting projects that we have currently active, and now I'll move to a few of the research projects that we have. First one that I want to mention there on the list is the content moderation project, which Greg on our team is leading. So he is in, again, a consultation phase, actively talking to companies, investors, and subject matter experts. He's had just above 10 engagements so far, and is developing some materials describing some of the outcomes of those consultations, which he can and will provide to the board. He's also, as you'll recall, part of that project was to understand the ways in which this thematic issue might map to our general issue categories. So how would we capture this across our different issues that we consider? And so he's in the process of mapping that general thematic kind of trend to our specific issues based on his initial evidence and market consultations. He believes he's on track to be able to produce some key deliverables, which are kind of the resulting taxonomy of how we think about this issue across our general issue categories, a summary of consultation, and potentially a recommendation as to whether and how to proceed with standard setting again at the next board meeting in Q2. For the plastics risks and opportunities project, similarly to the previous projects, Gail is leading that project and is actively involved in consultations. Again, having spoken to about 10 investors, as a reminder, that project, a lot of the consultation there was focused on confirming investor interest in the topic. So she's been focusing a lot of her conversations there, as well as talking to industry experts and companies around some of the details of the issue, and continuing her core sort of fundamental research around how this issue is manifesting across the different SASB industries that it may impact. And similar to previous projects, given the progress that she's made to date, is targeting the Q2 meeting for a recommendation around whether and how to proceed with standard setting. Q2 is going to be a fun meeting. And then lastly, well, three more things to mention. The human capital project is obviously one of our fairly significant scopes of work. It's a research project. Kelly is leading that and has been doing a huge amount of work. The first phase of that project, to remind folks, was conducting an extensive literature review to inform an initial draft of what we'll produce from this project, which is a human capital framework, which will help describe the connectivity between human capital issues and value drivers and financial impacts. And that framework will then help inform our view on potential standard setting work that would follow the conclusion of that research project. So a very foundational part of that project is this initial literature review, which she has been working on very diligently, reviewing I don't know how many papers, and special thanks to members of the board who have been engaging with her to provide and point her towards valuable resources there. She's also working through taking that initial literature review and understanding how that can inform our view on human capital and the general issues that we define related to human capital. So she's actively working on drafting what that framing might look like based on that literature review. So that's scheduled to go throughout the end of this quarter, and then we'll start to move and look towards more extensive outreach and engagement following the development of that preliminary framework. So we'll be able to provide you with updates on the progress on that in the next board meeting.
So can you talk a little bit more about the framework? So this is not part of the standard setting activity, but sort of our thought leadership around human capital. So help me understand the timing of that, and also what you like, what sort of input an exposure you would give to the standards board for either education or for input on that project.
Yeah, we can provide you with a more in-depth look at all the different phases of the project and where there would be opportunities for the board to review the preliminary framework or versions of the framework that will develop and iterate over the course of getting market feedback. So we can take it as an action to follow up and provide a memo to you on that would describe and provide transparency into that. But there will be essentially multiple phases of market feedback. Then we will put that framework out for a public exposure, and then we will finalize the framework likely in the early part of next year.
Any thoughts on how to do that to not sort of conflate this in the public's mind with the standard setting activity that
That's
we're
fair.
doing?
I mean, I think we'll need to communicate clearly, this is a research project, it's not a standard setting project. The objectives of that project are on our website now, but we're going to be building out our project descriptions on the website to better capture exactly what the project is, what phase it's in, what are the near-term objectives, and so on. I think this is a project that requires us to constantly be engaged with the market and helping them to understand this is purely that research phase. It will inform our view to initiate potential standard setting projects that would implement what's found in the framework in the standards ultimately.
The blog post on it is pretty good.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
Just sort of defining what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah, so definitely go read the blog post. That was very well written, and thank you for the reminder, Mark. So that's the human capital project.
On human capital, I think on the market activity, we just need to be sure we're up to date on the SAC thinking. And as we think about it more, maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. But for example, if that group came to some conclusion more quickly than the completion of our project and opted for some other framework or created criteria, that we should be thinking about, how can we engage, be part of that. So we don't know what that outcome is going to be. We don't know what that timing is, but I think it's important for us to react to that if something is going to happen.
It's a great point. It's definitely something that's on our radar. We're maintaining good visibility into if something were to come out of that, to the extent it would revise our approach, we would obviously come back to the board and propose an alternative scope to the project. So it's one of those key initiatives out there that we're watching very closely and is very much linked to how we might conclude how the framework would inform potential standard setting.
I think that's a key point. One of many initiatives really around the world, including the Workforce Disclosure Initiative or the Human Capital Management Coalition and other groups, coalitions, regulators that are actively addressing or working on the topic.
EU directive.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There's a lot of,
absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of initiatives. That's a great point. Thanks, Brian.
So again, thoughts then on the timeline for the framework, and then?
Yeah, so Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong since you're here, but the timeline would be to wrap up the framework itself, I think in Q2 of next year.
Next year.
Yes, that's correct. And so so at the end of this quarter would be the literature review, then would be, of course, the consultation, which would be the next 2 quarters, then drafting the framework and revising the framework, and then wrapping that up in early next year.
And then as that's developing, thoughts around potential timing for when we might see some clarity around where there are real opportunities to improve the standards using the framework.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think, as we move through the market consultation piece, we'll increasingly have insights into where there may be urgent or more clearly defined actions that we could take in the standards. So to the extent that there are opportunities to start some research on some specific standard setting projects, we may come to the board and suggest those to you. So I think we'll be in a good position to start to have some insight into that as we get through the market consultation phase, potentially prior to the formal issuance of the framework itself. So happy to provide you with insights onto that as we get more visibility into that part of the project.
Yeah, recognizing it's slightly unfair to ask you to predict the results of a research project. But it sounds like what you're saying is this would be the genesis of potentially multiple standard setting initiatives. Like there wouldn't be a single endpoint. There could be, in the middle of this project, you might discover, here's a worthwhile standard setting initiative we need to consider.
Yeah, the potential is there. If there's a clearly defined outcome that suggests to us standard setting is appropriate and necessary, we wouldn't necessarily hold that artificially until the end of the research project. So the last two that I'll mention are the Rules of Procedure project and the Conceptual Framework project, two of our core standard setting documents that Shivani is leading updates to. So I'll keep comments here brief, but around the Rules of Procedure, Shivani has been working very diligently with members of the project team on multiple drafts of the document, as well as facilitating project team reviews and feedback. And as per what's indicated here, is hoping to finalize the revised draft and prepare that for a potential exposure for public comment at the Q2 meeting of this year. And then the Conceptual Framework, again, a significant progress there with Shivani engaging with members of the board as well as the staff to solicit views and input on potential revisions to the conceptual framework, with the next period for her largely focusing on drafting potential revisions to that document, and ultimately moving towards, again, a public comment period, which is likely to occur later this year. And the timing of that will depend on our process to finalize the revisions to that document.
So I might comment a bit on the conceptual framework, just to note that in working on that project, the project team has thought about what to scope in and scope out, and what the purpose of the conceptual framework is. And so, you know, our view is that the conceptual framework is a foundational document that guides the process by which we do things, and it's also a very helpful document in communicating how we do what we do, why we do what we do. And so in looking at opportunities to improve the conceptual framework, the extensive session that we had yesterday on this with the project team clarified that we are not concerned with the way in which we do our work, but we do think that there are opportunities to improve how we communicate around that. And so as we're going through proposed revisions to the conceptual framework, it is really not intended to alter the path by which we do our work, but in fact to help us to better communicate why we do what we do, how we do what we do, the language that we use, and that is really important for the public, for those who engage back with us, to understand the language that we use and what we mean, so we understand each other in a consultative process. So looking forward to the proposal there. I suspect by Q2 we're hoping to have an exposure draft that we could bring to the board. Which, if I'm counting correctly, there are potentially 3 exposure drafts that could be brought to the board for Q2. And I just, I don't. The team is always, working diligently to make progress on things, and I understand the desire to continue to work on something until the last possible minute. I just remind you that the last possible minute is not right before the meeting. But yeah, to think about the timing there, I would just suggest that it'll be very helpful as an exposure draft is created, to make sure that every board member has had an opportunity to comment on it if they want, far enough in advance of the board meeting that could inform the board materials that you would bring, send out to the board in advance of the board meeting. So, in an ideal world, the board book comes out 2 weeks in advance of the board meeting, and that could have coalesced thoughts, individual board member thoughts around the exposure drafts. And so that means we need the exposure drafts, in advance of that 2-week deadline as well. So just thinking about the timing there.
So on the timing, on the standards related projects, is the end of the timeline the beginning of a public comment period or the ending of a public comment?
Would be the ending of a public comment. And of course, it'll always depend on the results of the public comment.
That's the idea.
That's the idea.
That now totally completes the project, and in a sense, there is a new standard in
Right.
place. If that's the
For a research project, it would be our recommendation to the board based on the conclusion of the research project.
To either move forward or table.
Exactly. Or extend potentially, but.
I did want to ask about that actually, that people of goodwill can sometimes differ on the content of the feedback we receive. And so extending, it's not we either live with the old standard we don't like, or we adopt a standard we may not be fully content with, we can extend it.
Absolutely, yeah. I would imagine in some cases, certainly we'd get feedback during a public comment period, and our recommendation would be to the board that additional research is merited based on the results of the public comment period. So that's certainly an option that's on the table. So as you noted, lots of items potentially on the agenda for the Q2 meeting. As we progress towards that, we'll of course firm up the agenda, and as you said, ensure that we have our ducks in a row for facilitating decision making on items that will appear on the agenda. But just want to again emphasize, obviously a tremendous amount of progress from the staff, and I want to thank them all for their efforts to move these projects forward as a priority, as well as continuing to build out our portfolio of projects. So I'll just briefly remind folks of our overall standard setting process, and really just want to zoom in, as I did at the last meeting, on some of the early phase items that the staff is continuing to look at as part of just their project screening and core sector coverage duties. And again, where we focus our efforts in project screening is really listening to the market, understanding where there may be potential areas for us to work on to improve the standards, of course, engaging with our standards advisory group, getting feedback from the board, and then our core research and surveillance activities for the industries that we cover. So these are early phase items that we're looking at, but want to provide transparency to the board and to the public about that. Many of these you are still on our radar from the previous meeting. One that you'll see has been removed is the alternatives proteins project, which is now moved out of the screening phase and into the research project phase. And a new item that has been added is the item, I believe the 5th item there, looking at biodiversity metrics in the oil and gas midstream industry, where we have some feedback from companies in the industry asking us to take a closer look at a metric associated with the topic, and specifically how we define areas of elevated biodiversity risk. So that's something that Ekaterina is looking at. And then just as a brief reminder, we continue to look at several items related to climate. This remains a priority area for us, given the evolving understanding of the issue, investor interests, and corporate disclosure. So as a reminder, looking at transition risk across multiple industries in the energy value chain, extractives, transportation, and infrastructure. Better understanding physical climate risk in the extractives and infrastructure sectors, given some of the characteristics of those industries and how that creates exposures to physical climate risk. And then climate risk, looking at bank loan portfolios, which is a project that Anton is continuing to look into. Another climate-related project here is in the consumer goods sector, and that's looking at greenhouse gas emissions across multi-lane retail and or e-commerce industries. So quite a bit of research around this general area of climate-related risks or opportunities.
Since we're talking about climate, and since there is such an emerging degree of commitment from corporations reporting related to climate risks and opportunities, especially with the TCFD recommendations, understanding that TCFD has specific requests around scope 1, scope 2, but also what we can offer is a industry-specific lens around that. I think about our thought leadership on this in the past. The technical bulletin on climates that we issued now, I think 4 years ago. Yeah, maybe even more. Yeah. I think it was widely viewed as very helpful, and I think it was pretty influential in some of the frameworks that have developed since it came out. Is there a thought around the need or opportunity or benefit from updating that, and would that be helpful as part of this project screening that we're doing related to climate?
No, thank you. It's a great question. So it is a project that is in our queue, not a research or standard setting project from the board's perspective, but we did make some progress on that project and continue to. It's one of the items that we have on our agenda internally to look for resources to carry forward this year, given the importance of that document historically, as well as given the evolution of thought around climate risk and how our standards continue to remain very powerful tools to interpret and interrogate that. Definitely see the need within the marketplace for that resource. And so our hope is this year to be able to revise and update that document. Other projects that remain on our radar that I'll briefly mention are looking at aquaculture and the fishing industry and whether there is an industry standard needed to be developed there. Greg continues to look at, in conjunction with other analysts where this issue manifests, issues around data security and customer privacy. He's actually at a conference right now, better understanding this issue. He's also looking at issues around use of AI and big data in various industries in the tech and comms sector. Taylor's looking at issues around the structure of the e-commerce industry, noting that activities across e-commerce and multi-line industry are somewhat blending in some cases, and so looking at the industry structure of those industries. Anton is looking into commercial banks, consumer finance, and investment banks, again, similarly looking at activities across those industries and the structure of the standards currently, whether we need to think about potentially changing the structure of those standards to better represent different activities in the banking sector. Looking at apparel and textile manufacturing industry structure, again, and you're seeing a common theme here around different 6 issues that we could look at. And then finally, Kelly's looking into access and affordability in the biotechnologies and pharmaceuticals industry. Really this idea of drug pricing continuing to be a very important issue for the industry that's continuing to evolve and receive investor scrutiny, and an area where we want to continue to be actively researching to ensure that our standards are providing the information that markets need to understand how companies are managing this issue. So lots of stuff on our radar. Want to just ensure that the board knows what we're thinking about. As we saw today, you may see projects come forward ultimately out of this early screening phase, but just wanted to ensure that you had some transparency into that as well as for the public as well.
So appreciate the update there and also the look ahead. That's the way I was sort of thinking about this. Help me understand a little bit more. There are a lot of issues up here, and one of the things we think about is capacity. As we look at the project timelines, we do see some exposure drafts coming in, and in some ways, exposure drafts do create a bit of a short window of capacity, not necessarily, depending on the results of public consultation, not necessarily long-term, medium-term capacity. So none of these projects is ending particularly quickly. So help me think a little bit about what the plan is in terms of what we might see in 2020 in terms of additional proposals, as we're still working on the existing pipeline.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, some of it will depend on overall, capacity constraints that we have based on the results of exactly what you mentioned, how some of these projects conclude or what we receive in terms of market feedback. So we have several research projects that will be either advancing to a standard setting project, or potentially we could conclude saying no standard setting is needing at this time, in which case we would have additional capacity to take on additional projects given those projects are concluding. To the extent that we are able to successfully move through public comment periods and conclude standard setting projects, we'll of course free those resources to take on additional projects here. But beyond that, it's really a question of these projects continuing to be analyzed by our staff and then looking for signals that would suggest that they meet the criteria for launching a potential research or standard setting project, assessing that against our agenda prioritization, market feedback that would suggest that they're urgent to carry forward, and then us bringing those forward to you as items we believe are sufficiently meet those criteria to merit us committing resources formally in the form of a research or standard setting project. So you can expect us to, as the project pipeline continues to fill, focus more on the capacity constraint item in some of our discussions in these meetings.
It's helpful. I think one of the things to be thinking about too is the goal is not just to get exposure drafts out. The goal is not just to get, sort of push something forward, but, and Mark can probably speak to this particularly well, that, the old adage of measure twice, cut once, the due process, as once we put something out for exposure draft, if it has a lot of, if there are a lot of concerns raised as part of that, then that will substantially increase the length of time it takes to complete a project. So, the decision to put out exposure drafts for public comment, I think, is a big one. Obviously, it's not a final one, but it is a big one in terms of the project planning and hoping to make progress in something. So, again, just being mindful to bring the entire board along on projects and also how important the market engagement is in between, so that we do have a high degree of confidence with what we put out for public comment. I don't know if Mark's got any. Just
No, you hit the nail on the head.
No, it's very well said, Jeff, and thank you. It's a good reminder for the staff, and that's how we plan to execute these projects and hope to deliver on that commitment to you as we bring forward items that we're recommending for public exposure. And I think another point that you raised that's a very good point is ensuring that we're reserving sufficient time to respond to that public comment, given we have an expectation about what we'll hear based on our consultation activities, but there's always the potential for us to get other input that would send us in a different direction, and we would need to have resources available to support that.
Other thoughts from the board about the pipeline, the process, and anything like that?
So Jeff, so a big project we talked about this morning, which I understand would be a more than daunting task, would be around translation. A couple things I'd like the staff to think about as we complete the rules of procedure and conceptual framework project. You might decide that's not worth it, but those could be translated, in fact, into the 8 languages, and there at least be something someone could look at the very front end in their language. You might determine that it's not worth it, but I would like you to think about that. I think also on the other translation, as you think about that project, who could do it, how you break it down. Again, it would not be perfect, but as you look at certain languages in certain countries and certain sectors or industries that are very overwhelming or very material in those countries, those could place a priority to translation. So the project becomes, we're not getting it all done at once because we know we can't, but maybe we cherry pick that. So I think that's more something for you to think about.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I think in an effort to overall optimize how we're allocating our finite resources, being able to effectively prioritize, and especially as it relates to translation, which can be quite time consuming, it's a great point. Something for us to keep in mind.
And I think it speaks to the capability of this group. Any one of these topics is a remarkable intellectual challenge to sort of process, and to be handling this many simultaneously speaks to the bandwidth we have on staff.
I think one other thing we have, we haven't really discussed, but it's certainly an opportunity. We do have our regular convenings of the board, which are scheduled in advance, but we do have the ability to also convene in the interim to the extent that it would be helpful to have decision making on something. in all likelihood, not in advance of the planned board meeting, but if for whatever reason it wasn't quite at the point for decision making, feel free to say, we can't get that to this one, but we also don't want to delay a project by 3 months. So, it might be that 3 weeks later, we can have a public call, and have a short meeting to discuss a particular issue. Just in terms of, but again, better to make sure that there's plenty of time to digest and bring everybody along than it's very difficult working with the intermittent meetings of the board, but that's just another thought around that.
That's really helpful, Jeff. Thank you. I'd say very, very aligned with your thinking. The staff the strong desire would be to align these major decision points with our scheduled board meetings, but to the extent something's off cycle with that, and there would be a compelling reason why it would be in SASB's interest and our stakeholders' interest to schedule an ad hoc meeting to move a project forward. We appreciate your offer to convene in that way, and we'll probably take you up on it. So thank you for highlighting that.
I won't be the only one on the call. The rest of the Any other thoughts, Elizabeth? Invite you to weigh in if you've got any thoughts on the pipeline or the project screening.
No, I don't have any thoughts from a content perspective. I sent an email to some of you that I think maybe next time, and everybody can weigh in if they disagree with me. It might be helpful to start with this context setting conversation before we go into the proposals, because I think seeing some of the issues that are still in project screening stage, and then how things lay out against each other from a timeline perspective, may have been helpful in the conversations that we had on the topics that we discussed today. So just an idea for consideration next time.
I think so. I very much in agreement to the extent that it helps us think about scope and relationship to other projects. I don't want us to get too caught up in concerns about capacity, because this can look daunting, but I think we have to also trust the leadership of the research team to make those assessments about capacity. And I think if you showed this to me at the start, I just would note that capacity-wise, I'm trusting their judgment. I think we're all trusting their judgment on that. But certainly,
and I would agree with that. It's more around trade-offs and evidence of whether some things are more important than other things. So that's just the thing that was on my mind as I was looking at this. But otherwise, I have no other comments.
Got it. Thank you, Elizabeth. Any other thoughts? If not, let me go ahead and note that our next public board meeting will be June 22nd and 23rd. Our Q3 board meeting will be September 17th and 18th. We have tentatively scheduled that we may have a board meeting around in December around the annual symposium. So that is to be determined, but I would suspect that will happen. So I would invite people to put that onto their calendar, follow what we do. And again, for those who have been listening in, if the comments today and the discussion has piqued your interest, or if you have comments or concerns, please do reach out. We'll be shutting the webinar shortly, but you are always welcome to contact us through our public comment portal, or on specific projects through the project managers that you can find on our project website. So with that, I will thank everybody for their active participation today. Thank the research team for all of the work that they've done in preparing the board for this meeting, and for all the work that they do in the background, and for the support to actually host the meeting. But with that, I will go ahead and officially close early for the day, the meeting, and thank everyone for their attendance.